Hello and welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education, inspiration and action, with Paul Herman in San Francisco and me, Nigel Lake, in New York, and joined today by special guest host Doug Heskey. This is the third special event we have had this week marking Earth Week. We've covered everything from science-based targets to green jobs, Green New Deals and a job guarantee. We have a fascinating show today about the role that religions can play in addressing climate change. And tomorrow we have activating academia. If you've missed any of these, or if you'd like to register for the show tomorrow, please just visit esgx.org and you can sign up there. It's a good moment to thank briefly our sponsors, New Day Investments, HIP Investor and Pottinger. Just before we start, I wanted to make a couple of quick comments about where we stand today. It is the 50th anniversary of Earth Week and 50 years in which there has been an awful lot of talk. There has been amazing technological innovation, but still surprisingly little action. And I think the question for me today is how can big religious communities and faith-based investments really provide another catalyst to help drive change, because we certainly need it. I was going to share also just very briefly my own story, and I have lived in a whole variety of countries around the world. I went to school in the UK. The picture in the top left is Canterbury Cathedral. I was at school in the precincts of that cathedral. As a child, I lived in the Middle East and spent quite a lot of time in Jeddah and Saudi Arabia. And so much of that culture was something that was just normal to me as a child. And last year I had the opportunity to visit Israel for the first time. A little shocking given how old I feel I now am, but it was again a really extraordinary and invigorating experience. And I think all of these, the last picture in the bottom corner there is simply the flowers and extraordinary blossoms we have had in New York this spring in the face of all this crisis, and a reminder of the power and beauty of nature. So finally, there is a Q&A function down the bottom of your screen. Please do use it to ask questions and we will wind them into the discussion. And with that, I will hand over to Doug to take us into the session.
Great, Nigel. And Nick, I'm just noticing I can't start my video right now. Let's see here. All right, there we go. Nigel, thank you very much. What an appropriate time to be talking about faith-based investing this week. As I think everybody knows, April marks the celebration of three important religious holidays: Easter, Passover, and Ramadan, which actually begins this evening. New Day Impact is co-hosting today's event with ESGX and our partners at Pottinger and HIP because this past week, we introduced three new faith-based investment strategies into the New Day Impact investing platform: the Magni Catholic Values Strategy, the Magni Halakhic Strategy, and the Magni Islamic Stewardship Strategy. Our objective as an impact organization in collaborating with Magni Global Asset Management is to offer values-based investors opportunities to invest in companies that are truly aligned with their faith. Magni has worked for many years with leaders in their respective religions to integrate religious guidance into faith-based portfolios that they run. The three Magni strategies are now available on the New Day Impact Investing application that can be downloaded either in iOS or in Android, and individuals users can invest a minimum of $100. Historically, there's been an intersection of faith-based investing and investing with purpose, impact, and sustainability. Faith-based institutions were actual pioneers in employing these types of strategies now for decades. Perhaps most importantly, we as a community of impact investors recognize that the work that we're doing today needs to be done to solve for all of these global circumstances that we're working on. And these circumstances, these issues that we're solving for, are way too big for any one single organization to solve. It's critical that we pull together representatives from government, from businesses and corporations, from faith-based institutions, and from academic institutions to solve this shared challenge. So it's with great pleasure that we have joining us this afternoon several internationally recognized leaders from the faith-based communities. And moderating today's discussion will be the CEO and Chief Research Officer for Magni Global Asset Management, Kurt Lieberman. Kurt has decades of professional investment experience and has led Magni for almost a decade and has direct responsibility for overseeing the Magni investment strategies which now have investment performance records of more than 16 years. Kurt has held leadership positions at other corporate organizations, including Thomson Reuters, Ecolab, IBM, and McKinsey. He earned his BS degree in engineering from Harvey Mudd College and his MBA in finance from University of Chicago. I can't thank you enough for our entire community of impact individuals and institutions that are joining us today. And without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Kurt.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel. Nigel, Paul, everybody involved in putting this together, thank you very much. This is very exciting for me. I'm assuming everyone can hear me and can see me. Is that correct, Doug?
Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you, Paul. So with that, let me dive in. Before we introduce the panel, what I would like to do, if I can demonstrate this skill, is I'd like to show a couple of very brief slides to set up our conversation. Some have been partially covered by other comments, so I will go through them quickly. I put together a few things just as a starting point. It is Earth Day, Earth Week, and that's a significant event. What I hope we can get out of this panel is an understanding of the role of faith and environmentalism, to see how they overlap, to see what the guidance is. On top of that, to see that the religions are compatible, that they work together, and there's power in that working together. As a result of that, we can build a stronger and more resilient future. Impact investing is part of it, though for those of you that don't have a financial background, relax. This is not a financial services discussion. This is about faith, and this is about environmentalism. Next chart is just because I thought it came out cool with a picture of the Earth. Just for context, these are the major religions of the world. Forgive me for any of you that happen to be in a religion listed as other. That is not a sign of disrespect. I called out some slices based on who's participating. We have someone representing Catholicism and by extension all of Christianity, which would include Protestant. We have someone representing Islam. We have someone representing Judaism, small but very important religion. And then we have a panelist who will represent other religions, particularly the Eastern religions. As a side note, I never knew how many atheists there were in the world, and this is as good as you get on internet research, so take that for what it's worth. As you can see, we represent collectively across the panel the majority of mankind. Put a quote here from Darwin. In light of the pandemic, using Darwin probably seems appropriate. He did more than what he's most famous for. He has some rather interesting quotes. This is one of them. He was very much a believer in teamwork and togetherness and the power of collaboration. And I think that's what this is about, seeing that not only people of faith, but more secular people who are involved in the environmental movement, we can all work together, and through our working together, create more results, have more impact than any one of us could have on our own. Sustainability, it's a word that we talk about a lot in environmentalism and in the whole world of impact. I'd like to draw us back to the definition of the word. This comes from a dictionary of sustainability used in an environmental sense. It's about balance. It's talking about focusing on, yes, having sufficient things to address the needs of today, but doing that without compromise, specifically without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So the concept of enduring over in time is very, very important. Our panel, you'll see them in just a moment. They've been alluded to. We're very honored to have Dr. Etimio Tiliakos, who's Secretary General of the, forgive me, Dr. Tiliakos, my Italian is not very good or my Latin's not very good. I will do my best. The Fondazione Santissimus Annus Pro Pontifice, or I think Pontifice, if Steve, you, based on your pronunciation. It's a very powerful organization that many of you may not be familiar with. It brings social teachings of the church into society, and I can't think of a better organization to be represented in this. As Steve, in addition, we have Imam Assad Zaman, who's executive director of the Muslim American Society of Minnesota. Imam Assad and I have worked together for several years. He was very helpful as we were codifying Sharia and the Maqasid al-Sharia for use in our Islamic portfolios. And let me take this opportunity for those Muslims who are on the call to wish you a Ramadan Mubarak. Ramadan begins fairly soon this evening. Also on our panel is Dr. Abraham Unger. He is a professor at Wagner College. He is also an Orthodox rabbi, and he has worked with my organization in creating our halakhic portfolios. He's helped me understand halakha and its role and its guidance for investing. Last, but definitely not least, is Steve Young, who's a close personal friend. He's on my board of directors. I'm a member of the Co-Roundtable. Steve is Global Executive Director of the Co-Roundtable for Moral Capitalism. It is an organization that believes that capitalism, when done with ethical guardrails, is a very positive force for society. And let me go to the agenda, which is fairly simple, and then you will get to see all of us. Following this opening, each of the panelists will have an opportunity to talk a little bit about faith and environmentalism from the perspective of their faith. We'll have some panel interaction, and as was mentioned earlier, there is an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you use the tab at the bottom, you can type in questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And then we will close this first segment. When this first segment is over, please stay on. There's another segment where Steve will be talking to Anna Jane Joyner about creation care and a set of related topics. I think that'll be an excellent discussion as well. So with that, let me drop out of PowerPoint mode, and hopefully all of you can see me. I've introduced each of the panelists. Probably the easiest thing to do is to go ahead and begin to have each of you talk. And Dr. Tiliakos, would you mind beginning to talk a little bit about Catholicism, Catholic social teaching, and its connection to environmentalism?
Yeah, thank you to everybody. The Centesimus Annus Foundation is a foundation which was established, as you pointed out, about 26 years ago by St. John Paul II. And the name is after the publication of the first encyclica by Leo XIII, which took place in 1891. So 1 century and a quarter ago. The stress that the Catholic Church, starting with John Paul II, followed by Benedictus XVI with the encyclica Caritas in Veritate, and now more recently in 2015, the encyclical published by and delivered by Pope Franciscus, Laudato Si, are putting a stress on environment in a social sense. In the word of the Pope Franciscus, what we mean for environment is that we often have an improper use of natural resources and models of development that are not inclusive and sustainable, and continue to have, and we continue to have a negative effect on poverty, social growth, and social inequalities. The Laudato Si is not a green encyclical, but is a social encyclical because it puts together environment and man, in the sense that in the Catholic Church vision, they are not two separate entities. There is not a social crisis and environmental crisis. There is only one single crisis, which puts together the problem of the nature of the environment and the social problem, because they are interconnected. The man is impacting heavily the environment, and the environment is causing, as we have seen recently with this disease, the coronavirus, is impacting heavily also not just the health of the man, but also the society as a whole, the way the society is organized, and is shaking the fundamental of the society, because it's also questioning the role of the institutions, what the institutions are expected to do. Everybody is saying everything will be completely different tomorrow when we shall start to work again. We shall live in a different world from the world that we were used to. But in fact, something will be radically different. Something will be, unfortunately, very much the same. The human attitude take time to be changed. And faith in this can actually represent a bridge, can accelerate the process of this human development, human change of attitude, to make the man more apt to what the future scenario will be. If we are looking at in pure economic terms, what the situation is now, we can find out that we are not talking about something which we were used to, because when we are talking about pandemic disease, we are talking about events which have been taking place in the last few decades. And if we are trying to estimate the cost of this, also apart from the human lives, from the human being who have died for this infectious disease, but we are looking at the economic impact. This has been estimated by the World Bank for the old SARS, which affected the world or part of the world in 2003 in about $40 billion US. The impact of the West Africa Ebola outbreak has been estimated in the region of $53 billion. And so the flu, which affected in 2009 the world, more or less the same level, 45 to 55 billion. But what we are facing today is something much bigger. We are facing today a problem which the World Bank has been estimating in the region of 3 trillions. 3 trillions, billions of billions, millions of billions. So the problem is a much bigger problem, and we cannot face the impact of this economic, very large economic problems simply with economic instruments, but we have to change completely the attitude of the men, the attitude of the local groups, the attitude of the nations, the attitude of the world as a whole, of the human community, whole human community as a whole. And we have to envisage a new world in which faith has got a much bigger role than before.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Assad, could you go next, please?
Sure. Allow me to present my slide in 1 second.
Sure.
So thank you very much for having me here. I'm very honored to be here. Oh, I need to, oh, I can't just start it. I actually have to share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Islamic perspective on environmental consciousness or awareness. And first of all, perhaps I should describe the overview perspective that Islam brings to this picture. And I'm going to walk you through about 4 verses of the Quran that sort of sheds light, 4 or 5 verses that shed light on this concept. So the first concept that we want to bring people's attention to, that in Islam, we perceive that the whole world belongs to God and human beings are temporary custodians or stewards of this. And as the owner, God has the right to dispose of the matter of this world, and he retains the right to tell us what our limits are. So this particular verse in chapter 4 says, لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. To God belongs whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on the earth. وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ وَكِيلًا. And God is the disposer of all affairs. In the next verse in chapter 20, it gets called out in a much more explicit way. God says, لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا وَمَا تَحْتَ الثَّرَى. To God belongs whatever is in the heavens, whatever is in the earth, whatever is in between the heavens and the earth, and whatever is under the earth. All those things belong to God because he created them. They are his. Right? Now, so what role can we as humans have? In chapter 2, God describes how before he created Adam, a conversation he had with the angels, where he said, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. God said to the angels, I intend to make upon the earth a steward, a caretaker. Right? In another verse in chapter 6, وَهُوَ الَّذِي جَعَلَ لَكُمْ خَلَائِفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَرَفَعَ بَعْدَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْدٍ. It is God who made some of you stewards upon the earth and has elevated some of you above others. And this is in the form of a test, so that he may test you through what he has given you. So these verses, and I'll get to the last verse in a minute, these verses set the intellectual foundation in Islam for the idea that, so imagine for the sake of argument that if I am the owner of 10,000 acres of land, and on that land there are 3 lakes. So I'm the owner, can I do whatever I want in it? Right? So on what basis does anybody have the right to prevent me from dumping radioactive waste in my lake? I own it. And the Islamic response to that theoretical argument would be, well, first of all, you are not the real owner, you are just the steward. You are the temporary custodian. So one of the meanings, one of the names of God, and God has 99 names, one of the names of God is Al-Warith, the inheritor. Now, the inheritor is a very strange name for God. I mean, obviously, God has other names like the owner, the bestower, the merciful, the powerful. But the inheritor is a weird name because the inheritor is the one who takes a property because somebody else died, right? That's the meaning of the word inheritor. So God has taken for himself the name Al-Warith, the inheritor, because eventually a day will come when all of humanity will pass away. And then all the wealth will go back to God because they were his to begin with. So that's the meaning of, so now we are temporary custodians and we are required to stay within our lane. And this verse describes what happens when people don't stay in their lane. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر. Corruption has appeared or spread throughout the land and the sea because of the hands of what have been earned by the hands of people. And God describes in this verse that he allows this corruption to remain so that people can taste the consequences of their actions so they can come back to do good things. Right? So these are some, at a generic level, this presents from a Muslim perspective the intellectual framework for why human interaction, even on things we own, are subject to rational limitations and consequences. And so I think I'll end it here, and I'd love to hear the other panelists speak.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Asad. Abe? Abe, you're on mute. Sorry.
I'm going to take up Mr. Young's call, at least organizationally, from the introduction, though we haven't yet met in person. I'm glad to hear the phrase guardrails to capitalism, because rabbinic theology as manifested in law, known as halakha in Hebrew, which means a way of going, really does, I think, unintentionally, because it's a culture from antiquity, but nonetheless does provide that. The Jewish tradition, while it certainly has a theology and a doctrine underpinning it, namely the revelation of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch, the Torah, commonly known, which means teaching or instruction at Mount Sinai from God to Moses, and then to the children of Israel, hovering around the mount, as it were. That's sort of the founding emblem of Jewish theology. Nonetheless, Jewish life and theology is really manifested through action. And Judaism doesn't have a lot of codified, what Christian friends and Catholic friends of mine would call systematic theology. So we go right to law pretty quickly within the rabbinic canon, and even in Jewish theology itself. And Abraham Joshua Heschel, famous rabbinic activist, used to say that Judaism takes a leap of action as opposed to the classic phrase regarding religion, a leap of faith. And so we go right to the guiding principle regarding Judaism and the environment, and then I'll touch on climate change in a minute, because it does come up presciently in the Talmud, the rabbinic corpus around the turn of the Common Era, that brought down laws as interpreted from the Hebrew Bible according to the rabbinic tradition. And there's a principle called bal tashchis, which means don't waste. And Jewish law, the guardrails to capitalism in the case of the environment, if you can just walk away with 2 takeaways from what Jewish theology and practice or law, halakha, might say about the environment, it's don't waste and maintain a balance. So it's waste and balance. I always think of the acronyms WB. That's the WB network, as it were, from my adolescence. That's the acronym I always invoke when thinking about approaching the environment from a Jewish perspective, and certainly from a capitalist perspective, which I'm about to get to regarding energy specifically. So bal tashchis comes from a principle in the Bible itself, in the Hebrew Bible itself, that when you go to war, don't destroy the fruit trees. Basically, try not to spoil nature if you're going to make war on each other. Because as the Imam said, Judaism would share the view with Islam that we are all stewards of God's world. And there's a quote from the psalmist, which seems to resonate exactly with the quote that the Imam just cited from the Muslim tradition, which is Hashemayim Shamayim Ladoshem V'Haaretz Nasan Lifnei Adam, which means the heavens are the heavens of God, but the earth He's given to humankind. That's the aphorism that I cling to as an observant Jew. And so this idea of, keep an eye on nature even when you're going after each other is where we start. That's the primal myth, as it were, of Jewish environmentalism. And then that principle of bal tashchis, don't waste, don't spoil nature, taken from the Bible, is expanded by the rabbis themselves in the rabbinic canon, such as the Talmud, the quintessential piece of the rabbinic canon, to mean don't waste anything. Don't throw out unnecessarily a piece of clothing. Don't waste a piece of food. And they actually do go into specific items. And they do this as a guardrail against the free market, just to make sure it's not exploitative of the rabbis. Like the free market, they believe in free trade, the right to own a business, but they also want to make sure nothing goes to waste in the community. because either nature needs it or even humankind might need it or an individual might need it. So there's a sense of balance, the WB idea as I just invoked. Don't waste, keep a balance between what's really necessary and what you can, indeed dispose of legitimately or fairly. Two examples of that. In Jewish tradition, one's not supposed to eat the fruit off a tree for its first 3 years, a kind of sign of stewardship, as well as a respect for nature, not wasting things unnecessarily. I guess the Talmud figures and the Bible itself figures, after 3 years, you kind of know what you need. Elected officials don't always think far ahead, but I think 3 years is a pretty good time frame to really think about what long-term policy impacts might be. Nonprofits will know a lot of grants are given for 3 years, and then you're supposed to sort of find your own money. So 3 years, even the Bible and Talmud, they thought that was a pretty good time so you figure out what your real needs are. Second of all, the Talmud, I'll just end with this, very quickly, because this speaks to climate change specifically, does deal with, for example, in the principle of this Hebrew idea of Bal Tashchis, this law, don't waste energy and fuel. It actually mentions that. And so I think regarding climate change, as a professor of government, in addition to being a practicing Orthodox rabbi, as Kurt mentioned when introducing me, whenever I teach my chapter on public policy from my textbook on environmental policy, climate change is always tied in with energy policy, as we all know, because of fossil fuels. And so the rabbis presciently, they weren't thinking of fossil fuels scientifically at the turn of the Common Era, but they were certainly worried about energy, and they understood it related to climate, that for sure. And so again, don't waste, we're stewards, as I and the Imam have shared together, but maintain a balance in terms of a regulatory framework within what's also reasonable. And those are kind of the two guardrails that Judaism, halachically speaking, grounded in concrete behavioral patterns and its regulatory apparatus in Jewish law, sort of put around the idea of how to manage the environment reasonably yet carefully.
Excellent, Abe. Thank you. All three of our panelists are from the Abrahamic branch of faith, and I think you can hear some common themes across them. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to pull Steve into the discussion to talk about some of the Eastern faiths and some of the similarities and some of the differences that exist among those. So Steve, go ahead, please. You need to unmute. Steve, you need to unmute.
Sorry, thank you, Kurt. Let me categorize the Abrahamic faiths as faiths that believe in a creator God. And so our relationship to the environment is a reflection of our relationship to that creator God. What is the order that creator has given us? What is the expectation of us? If we slide away going east on the globe from the heartland of the Abrahamic faiths in the Middle East, we come to two other faiths, which are Indo-European. One is Zoroastrianism and the other is Hinduism, which we really don't have time to go into. But I'd just like to say that those two faiths have a kind of, if you will, quasi-creator God sense, I think. In Zoroaster, there's the spirit of light and spirit of darkness. In Hinduism, there's Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, which are the three forces of creation, and are represented in images and sort of a godlike quality to them. Out of Hinduism in India came Buddhism. Buddhism has two branches, one in Southeast Asia, which is called Theravada, which is pretty close to the original teachings of the Buddha. Then there's another branch called Mahayana, which goes to the north up to Tibet, a subsect of that, and then China, Japan, and Korea. And Mahayana, as I understand it, was the evolution of thinkers coming out of original Buddhist thought, which put this notion of a bodhisattva, of spiritual beings of great power to whom we supplicate. We are supplicants to them, and bodhisattvas can help us out. The Buddha himself in the Theravada version, which I know best from living in Thailand, looks at a concept which is really an environmental concept, if you ask me. It's the Dharma. And if you go back to the Proto-Indo-European origins of the word Dharma, you get dur, which means to hold up, to uphold. So what Buddha is trying to teach is how do we sustain ourselves, uphold ourselves in life. And he comes up with a general framework of the middle way. We avoid extremes, which probably echoes some of the concepts of don't waste, which we heard from the Talmud. In order to find this middle way, there's sort of the Noble Eightfold Paths of right thinking, right speech, and they are shaped by mindfulness. Now, what I want to generalize for most of the East Asian religions is that I think a number of scholars have looked at them as ethics rather than quote unquote religions, because they don't necessarily have a creator God, and they focus on human relationships with other people. They don't necessarily focus in the past on like the environment. But one, therefore, today, you could sort of go into the tradition, find something in the tradition, and from that develop a stewardship ethic about the planet, which would align with what we've heard from the Catholic faith, the Muslim faith, and the Jewish faith. When we get over to China, one of the core Chinese religious in their sense, maybe with a small r, is the Confucian Mencian tradition of proper living in life, people versus people, which again, a number of Western scholars and many Christian missionaries who went to China tended to belittle this as merely an ethic. It's not really a religion. But the Confucian view rests on an understanding of heaven as a great natural force. But it does primarily focus on our relationship, minister, Lord, father, son, wife, daughter, propriety, the notions of propriety and humaneness and humanity towards others. Now there is in China, there are two other traditions which are slightly different. One is the Taoism, which is in the books that many of you know, the Tao Te Ching, which are sort of short poems, and they're not necessarily, they don't explain things. They're artistic. And the concept in this Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching, is in Chinese is Wu Wei, which means do not weigh. And wei is a word which is humanly created positions, actions, which can be subject to abuse, to greed, to harm. And so to follow the Tao, the way of heaven, you try to restrain your human instincts. I would say that this is an approach which in the West, we would maybe associate with the Greeks in this notion of hubris, that human hubris, taking as much as you want, doing anything you want. Pope Francis, as Eutimio was talking about, describes this as anthropocentrism. It's all about us. It's not about nature or other people, just about us. Taoism says, no, that's not the way to live. There's another text that some of you may have heard about called the I Ching, which is a series of lines, solid lines and dotted lines, which they're grouped in different patterns of 6. And they're supposed to tell us about the flow of yin and yang in the cosmos. This is a kind of naturalism. But again, the interpretation of the yin and yang is more about how we get along with each other and not so much about how we get along with nature, but it is a naturalism. Finally, let me mention Shinto in Japan, which I think in East Asia is probably the closest religious practice to an environmentalism. As some of you may know, Shinto is a very, very ancient faith among the Japanese, which doesn't come from Buddhism. It doesn't come from the Chinese. It comes from probably a late Neolithic, early, late Stone Age, living with nature. And the idea of Shinto is the kami, that in everything, in trees, in rocks, in water, in grass, here and there, are spirits, the kami. They are independent and they have power, and we are to respect them. And we are to come before the kami in the Shinto shrines with a clean mind. And a clean mind is I think it's to some extent, it's an open mind, it's a clean mind, it is not self-seeking. So this puts the Japanese, any of you who've seen Japanese gardens or something like that, there's a certain quality of reverence the Japanese have for nature. So Kurt, let me just quickly summarize there and say there are ways of getting to an environmentalism, I think, from the Eastern religions, but it has not really been a strong part of their traditional practice.
Interesting. Thank you. That's excellent. I'm hearing some common themes, and I'd like to bring Dr. Tiliakos back. You began what I heard is you introduced the concept of the social element, and that environmentalism isn't environmentalism for its sake, but it needs to live in a social construct. My sense was each of the faiths that were discussed had that social element in it. Did you hear the same thing?
Yeah, I did hear the same thing. This means that if we look at faith, the way that the Christians, I'm talking about in particular about the Catholics are looking at, is not a passive process, is not mere reflection, full stop, but especially, you know, with the thought of the new encyclicals, the one which were published in the last, let's say, 50 years, has become much more dynamic and much more inclusive of a concept of relation of the man, not as the entity which dominates the creation and makes whatever use he wants to do of the creation, but something which puts him in relation with the creation, the natural creation, as part of himself, as part of the society. And I like, if you allow me, to quote two passages of the Laudato Si, in which, in particular, the number 181, in which the Pope says it should be said that though even the best mechanism can break down when there are no worthy goals and values, or genuine and profound humanism to serve as the basis of a noble and generous society. He adds that we therefore need faith to fill this gap, and so to create this bridge. This is a part of the faith profess, which is requested to each believers. And there are two elements which is underlined. One is the vision. So not just behave according to rules because we think that the rules are appropriate, are part of the law, and I just respect the law, but the vision includes the possibility of creating a common good for the future, for the next generation, next few generations. And the second one, which is closely associated with the idea of vision, is the idea of hope. Because if the vision we are having and the goal we have to aim at needs also the hope that I can do it, we can do it, we can have a process to achieve the goal that we have set. And in this sense, it's like to move from a single frame picture to a movie, to something much more dynamic.
Wonderful, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. My understanding in Catholic social teachings that the term for the direct environmentalism would be about the universal destination of goods. Is that,
yeah.
Do I understand that correctly?
Correct.
So what I'd like to do is actually ask Abe a question. In Catholicism, we have universal destination of goods, which is everything is God's good. And I think that connects very well with Islamic stewardship, that which exists in the world is God's, and as human beings, our job is to be good stewards of it.
Yeah.
I think that fits well, but it's a little different than what's in Halakha. Do you feel the same compatibility that I do, Abe, or do you see it differently?
I think in Halakha, there's a little bit more room for a sense of more permanent, and I'll give an example of what I mean in a second, but not fully permanent ownership of a good. So one doesn't own one's property in perpetuity, but one can own a piece of property. You know, let's call it a 99-year lease, which I think is often done in Israel, actually. So there is this sense And by the way, there is a sense in the Talmud of, there's 3 volumes in the Talmud just dealing with laws of damages, of what happens, if you damage someone else's property. So there is a sense of ownership that I think is pretty strong, but recognizing that ultimately it is not yours forever, whatever that end date, whatever that sunset date might be of the property. Again, it's a sense of balance and a sense of intuitive respect for God's oversight of the world, but day to day, one acts as if one owns.
That sounds also like it connects in, Assad, with the idea of the inheritor, right? That which is not permanent to human beings is ultimately going to become part of Allah or God.
Yeah, it will ultimately revert back to its original and final owner.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Assad, let me take it on a quick tangent. Is there a part of Ramadan that you would consider to be environmental?
Not directly. However, one of the things that Ramadan forces a human to do is the art of discipline, the art of self-discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So Muslim theologians explain this concept that eating food or drinking water is normally halal, is normally a permissible thing to do. Then why tomorrow during this time it will be impermissible? Why that? And the underlying reason, actually, there is no reason except God said so. What is the reason? Why I can drink water today at 5 o'clock and tomorrow at 5 o'clock I cannot? Because God said so.
Mm-hmm.
And now, so the human being learns that God has the right to set limits. So this is my acknowledgement of that reality. Then there is a second element is, hey, I want to drink water, but I can't. And so I need to learn to restrain myself. And I think that is what Rabbi Unger was talking about, that there has to be an element of restraint. Because the human has biological abilities beyond his need. So imagine if you think in a very caveman setting, the human has the ability to catch and kill 30 fish, but he only needs 3. You see what I'm saying?
Yep. Yep.
And today, with modern science and technology, the human has capacities way larger than their needs and their. So I have the capacity to consume 10 pounds of chocolate. Should I? What would be the consequence of that consumption?
Yep.
Right? So or this capacity to do war, capacity to redirect a river. We have that capacity. But just because we can, should we?
Yep.
So that restraint is taught to us in Ramadan.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. It kind of segues me over to Steve, because what I'm hearing in the Abrahamic faiths is the world is God's. God allows humans to have freedom, to have actions. There can be consequences from those actions. God provides instruction to the right or the better way of doing things. Yet it's a little bit different, Steve, if I heard you correctly, which is in the Eastern religions, because it's not a theologically centric view of environmentalism, it's about the social interaction and keeping things in balance. If I really boiled it down to its reduction sauce, is that the unifying message across the Eastern faiths?
This is all very, very loose and simplistic, but one of the phrases that sort of comes out of Buddhism, but I think applies generally, is what is. The world is. It's just there. Mm-hmm. It's yin, it's yang, it's the influence of the Dharma, it's water, and therefore the human relationship to that is quite open-ended. And therefore the way the human relates to what is internal to the mind and the heart of the human person. So for Buddhism, you have mindfulness, you you have the middle way, which authorizes and permits use of property and things like that, but don't go too far.
Mhm.
Mencius is very clear in the Confucian tradition that he talks about if I'm a farmer, I have a right to whatever I farm, what I get, and I can exchange my farm product with the cobbler who makes shoes. And Mencius has a very sort of almost Adam Smithian free market sense of what I can do to take care of myself, because I am, the shoes are, the crops are, the land is. But if I then abuse my expropriation, if you will, of what is, then I've transgressed. But that's a person-to-person relationship. And then in certain traditions, there are issues as to whether that's a matter for the state and the law, or whether that should just be an issue of ethics and self-control and social shaming.
Very good. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Good discussion. We have a question from our audience, and I'd like to throw it out here. And I'm not sure who wants to take a crack at it. I'm going to read the question. The faiths represented here all have strong historical and present roles in banking. How can the common good amongst those with faith, and even none at all, work to bring this to create a new social contract between finance/money and civil society? And who will take the lead?
Well, I mean, that's a mouthful.
It is.
Let me just suggest one thing, which we've been talking about at the co-roundtable, which is, what is capital? Is capital only money? Is it only finance? Or does capital include things like nature, natural capital? What about human capital? Motivation, skill, the results of education, the ability to relate to other people. What about social capital? Law and order, a sense of discipline, a sense of respect for others. If we expand this concept of capital, which is underneath finance, and we ask, how do we invest? And what's the return on human capital, social capital, moral capital? I think we would begin to design a more balanced and complex structure.
And I think, something you and I have talked about in other settings, it also would help us, because right now environmentalists tend to try and force external costs into the model as a way of representing the environment. But a broader sense of capital means you've got a much more intrinsic way of measuring things, and you don't have to be trying to force an external cost structure on to account for environmental impact.
The other thing I think it's fair to say, and Imam Assad on the Quranic approach, the interest in riba, but I mean, Marx, I think, gave us some important insights, and of course he came from a Jewish moral tradition, that somehow when you have money, you have a piece of gold coin, you have a piece of paper, you have an entry into a ledger in some computer program, you have separated this thing, you've objectified this thing, but you've separated it from the rest of life. And you're going to pay a price, maybe a spiritual, maybe an ecological price, when you divorce this money and you segregate it out. And then the other factor, which is very clear, I think, on the Christian tradition, is you turn that into an idol. I mean, I think there's what always was meaningful to me in the New Testament. It says, what does it profit a man if he gained the whole world, if thereby he loses his soul?
So from a Muslim perspective, from a banking perspective, we make a distinction in the Sharia between wealth and the representation of wealth. So wealth can be gold or silver or houses or land or, pieces of wood and pieces of iron. Wealth can also be represented in knowledge. It can be intangible, like the good name of a person is a form of wealth recognized in the Sharia. what we as modern economists call money, M1 or M2 or M3 money, are representations of underlying wealth. They're not real wealth. They represent a share in a basket of real wealth. It could be the American economy or the Bangladesh economy or something. The problem is we in the Islamic system, we don't allow money, which is not real wealth, to be rented. That is at its core the issue between Islamic banking and regular banking. So for a loan to be issued, there must be real underlying wealth. So you cannot swap pieces of paper like credit default swaps, which caused the collapse a decade ago. Every transaction of that type is inherently restricted because the underlying wealth has not been encumbered in that transaction. So every single transaction must have real value, real wealth.
And shared risk.
Yes.
If I could just jump in on the Jewish perspective on that, because I want to start from a place that is before, I guess, riba in Islam and somewhat analogous system in Judaism called ribas. There's analogies there. But I want to start from before that point. So from the point of view of Judaism, wealth, money, transaction, a barter economy, a merchant economy, a cash economy, it really doesn't matter. Whatever is happening in the private sector is simply viewed as an instrument of hopefulness regarding, people's behavior and living out of their values. So the Western liberal system, of which we are all somehow a product, we can't avoid it, regardless of how ensconced we are in our faith, presumes a cynicism in human nature, whether it's Adam Smith or Karl Marx. Both kind of had a negative, selfish view of what people really are at their core. Judaism, and I think all the other faiths, presume a kind of hopefulness about human nature. So wealth and the accumulation of capital thereof, and the way financial markets are brought to bear on the creation of wealth, is viewed as an act of hopefulness, as an act of faith. One can live out one's values and make a better world through, whether it's the banking system, through appropriate regulation, through one's investment. So there's a kind of, and I'll close on this, a kind of note of hopefulness regarding, in the free market, as it were, regarding what people can accomplish through it, simply as one other instrument from a pool of capitals, as a pool of capital markets, as it were, beyond the narrowest definition of the term that Mr. Young brought to bear on this conversation.
Great, thank you. I think if we had the time, we could explore the Catholic guidance around usury, which is a bit different, but I think it derives from some of the same core beliefs. It's been an absolutely delightful conversation. I'd like to give each of my panelists a chance to provide a summary. And Dr. Tiliakos, would you mind going first?
Well, to summarize such an extensive debate is rather difficult, but I like to point out and maybe follow up with the considerations that were made recently about capital and profits. In Catholic social thought, profit and capital are not evil, are very good thing, which is perfectly acceptable. What the Catholic social thought say as a derivation of some of these origin in Aquinas and in, of course, the Greek philosopher and Aristotle in particular, is that whatever you do, it's perfectly acceptable that you make profits, that you have capital, that you invest capital. The important thing is that this should not create damage to the other people in an explicit form, in a direct form. The other thing is that you have got to be aware. You have got to be aware of the fragility of the world and the fragility of the society, and you have to respect this fragility. So the watershed between your interest and your search for profits and benefit in the use of capital has got to be delimited by what you are doing to the other people. If it's something which is in the interest of the society as a whole, is okay. If it's going to harm section of the society, this is not good, and you have to temper your activity. You have to temper your greed for money and for profits.
Wonderful, thank you. Assad, would you mind going next?
Sure. I actually want to jump off of a point Dr. Tiliakos made. So there are elements of Islamic understanding that are very, very capitalistic, and there are elements that could be deemed socialistic. From a capitalistic perspective, the capital is not evil. In fact, the search for growth of business and profit is a righteous action that a Muslim person can undertake. Islam views capital merely as an instrument. It is not inherently good or evil. It's what we do with it. But we have a perspective that says stagnant capital causes problems. So for the capital must be flowing and circulating through the economy. And for that reason, the Sharia creates a penalty for stagnant capital called the zakat system. So if somebody inherited $1 billion and just sits on it, over time, that amount is going to be shrunk by the zakat tax that will be imposed. So he has a duty to actually grow his capital at a rate higher than the zakat rate. A second thing that Islam does is, okay, the person can grow their capital as much as they want, but when they die, Islam will break that wealth to designated inheritors that cannot be disinherited. And this will force the wealth to circulate. So these are some of the means by which, because circulating wealth in a term in the Sharia is it brings barakah, it brings the blessings and the bounties of God on it when it is being circulated for business.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Assad, you have Ramadan to get to. And
thank you, and if you will excuse me, I apologize, I have to leave.
Not a problem. Great to see you, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Abe.
Sure. So just to sort of frame this concept of waste and balance that are always married to each other, and those variables are always being weighed against each other, and thinking about Judaism and the environment. Overall, the halacha itself is a little bit at odds with Western liberalism, just like it's at odds in its intrinsic view of the innate goodness of human nature, at odds with Adam Smith and Karl Marx, as it were. It also, rather than speak a language of rights, it speaks a language of responsibility. It presumes rights as a correlate of duty, but it starts out with a language of what do I owe to my family, my community, my state, and beyond that to the world at large, to the global community of humankind. And so I think that's the place where we start in terms of thinking about Jewish tradition and other variables such as the economy or finance or what have you. We start from a place of human social responsibility with the ultimate end of the intrinsic sense of people as good at heart and wanting to use whatever instruments at their disposal for the good to live out their values more positively. So it's all about responsibility ultimately, even in the most concrete legal sense.
That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you, Abe. Steve.
Just a thought that for many reasons, we tend to assume that faith and investing, faith and money don't go together. It's sort of like you can't serve God and mammon. But I think the people listening to this would be getting a sense that what the faith traditions are teaching us is a kind of prudence. And prudence in this world is risk management. And risk management is directly related to the expectations of what you're going to get. If you do foolish, stupid things, you're going to lose. And so I think there is a way of faiths actually guiding us, our different faiths guiding us towards responsible, prudent actions, which are going to make the world better.
Excellent point. If I could riff off of that, now that'll be the basis of my summary. I think one of the things that we as society need to work through is the multi-faith view of society. Through a lot of history, countries have been more single faith focused, and as a result, there was a shared sense of norms that drove the guardrails on society. And we have ever more interfaith societies, and this exploration has shown us that the teachings are compatible. We need to build greater awareness of that so that the norms that help form the guardrails to do the good risk management are more easily accepted in all communities. There's a lot more that we could say. We are at our time limit. It's been an engaging conversation. There's one person in particular who has a whole set of topics that I think could form a whole new panel. So thank you all. Let me segue this to the second part. I would like to reintroduce Steve Young by spending a second on the co-roundtable for moral capitalism. Steve is the executive director. He's going to interview Ms. Joyner. The co-roundtable, CAUX, is a nonprofit focused on moral capitalism, that capitalism can be a force for good when done within an ethical framework. Their work goes back many years. The books that have been written, the people that have been involved in it are very illustrious. If all of you remember, August of last year, the Business Roundtable, which is an association of CEOs of major companies in the US, issued a statement where they changed the definition of a company from existing to optimize value for shareholders to one of managing across the stakeholder relationships. Since that time, the Business Roundtable has acknowledged that a guiding force in that change came from the co-roundtable and Steve specifically. He is one of the founders of corporate social responsibility. And Ms. Joyner, please, you have an illustrious background as well. I'm not going to attempt to do that. I'm going to allow Steve to introduce you, and I look forward to a great conversation. All of you, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And Anna Jane, it's nice to meet you indirectly at this time of social distancing. I have two things I think which would start off a discussion which would be of interest to the audience. Let me first ask you, creation care. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so just to give you a little bit of my background, I became an activist, a climate activist in college, where I had kind of a transformational experience studying abroad, as so many of us do. But my dad's actually an evangelical pastor, a very conservative evangelical pastor.
That's the second thing I want you to share with us.
Yeah, so I, as a kind of newly converted activist, we were really getting into quite a lot of youthful fights, me youthful, him not so youthful, but it was creating a lot of tension in our relationship. So I kind of decided that I was going to focus on the communication side of activism versus the science. And I kind of decided that I would play his game and read the Bible and see what it had to say about caring for the environment. And that's how I got into this work. And so basically creation care, there's kind of three, I mean, there's so many narratives within the Christian faith that speak to this, but the three that kind of came to the top as I was doing this initial research is the stewardship narrative that has already been so beautifully spoken to, so I won't recap that. And then the second one that I really love is this idea, I'll actually just read the verse. So it comes from Romans 1:20, and it's basically from the sense the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from that which has been made, so that people are without excuse. So that's essentially like the idea that God as creator, in the same way that any artist puts their own selves, their creativity, their heart, their passion, their energy into their creation, and obviously if you kind of believe in the Christian story, or in a lot of the parallels to other faith traditions, God as creator, it's God's masterpiece. And so the whole premise behind creation care is that if you're destroying God's masterpiece, then that's not honoring or loving God, which is of course the third kind of tenet that I was going to speak to, which is, the great commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor. And so if you're destroying God's creation and harming your neighbor through environmental injustice and pollution and climate change, then you're kind of you're hurting your relationship with not only your fellow neighbors but also God. So that sort of summarizes at least the Christian perspective on creation care. But of course, there's so many beautiful parallels that have been spoken to today about how they intersect with other faith traditions and spiritual traditions.
Could I ask you to share with us, Anna Jane, from your dad's perspective? I mean, is he a fundamentalist and an evangelical, or more an evangelical?
He is definitely he's a fundamentalist evangelical, I would say.
What is his take? What is his biblical take on why he would be, let's say, skeptical about climate change or what humans do?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Theologically speaking, he would agree with everything I just said. He would call himself an environmentalist, and he actually has like some pretty progressive views on some environmental issues. He hates plastic pollution. He thinks what we're doing with plastic pollution in the ocean is atrocious, and he's even given sermons about it. He hates mountaintop removal, coal mining, where they blow off the tops of mountains to get to coal mining. He actually really hates coal in general because of the air and water pollution and what that does to vulnerable communities and babies and mothers. And so there's definitely areas that we agree on, and certainly theologically we agree on the premises around stewardship and creation care. Climate change is a hard one because we are in the super partisan environment where I have in my career worked now with not only evangelicals, but more progressive Christians. I've worked with some amazing Catholics on the encyclical when it came out. Also other faith traditions. I have a podcast called No Place Like Home, and we're actually doing a series on where we interview different spiritual leaders about how their faiths help give us courage around climate change. So I know that there's these huge swaths of people of faith, or more spiritually oriented people who do care deeply about climate change and completely see the intersections. But my dad, because he is, we're in this partisan environment, hyper partisan environment, it's really it's not so much a theological issue for him. It's just a political ideology. Like his team doesn't believe in climate change. He watches Fox News and reads right-wing blogs, and he's actually in a minority. Like if you, the Yale Climate Comms project breaks down kind of the American population and how much each segment cares about climate change. And the deniers, people like my dad, are only 10% of the population. They're loud, but they're only 10%. But you have the huge, majority of people are, especially now, the most recent data are alarmed or concerned or, engaged. So the strategy, especially when this climate started first coming up, was to go after the people like my dad. I actually don't think it's the best strategy. I think there's so many people, people of faith, definitely included, who already care about climate change, and it's way more effective to engage them.
I was asking because there is a tradition in Christianity going back very, very early, and they usually quote Jesus Christ himself, which is not necessarily in harmony with what you're doing, or even Catholic social teachings, which goes to the expression of Jesus that my kingdom is not of this world. That the purpose of human life is to escape this world, basically. It is the next world that we should worry about. It is our salvation with God. And whatever happens in this world, this is a fallen world, Adam and Eve, all that sort of stuff. And so there's a withdrawal phenomenon. The early Christian anchorites who went into the deserts in Syria and lived apart from the world and from people, waiting for the second coming. Do you sense something like that among the evangelicals, that on one level they might agree with you, but they say my theology, my religion is telling me that the real world is yet to come?
Certainly that is, it's kind of like, why polish the ship if it's going down type of mentality. But that I get asked this question a lot. It's actually a pretty small minority of evangelicals that I've encountered where that is their hang up. Like, why care about this earth? Because I think the reality is, while there are sects of, I'd say particularly Pentecostal evangelicals, where it is very hyper focused on kind of the next world, some sects of sort of mainstream evangelicals, the first commandment in the Bible is to care for the garden, to steward the garden. We're taught to love and care for our neighbors, especially our vulnerable neighbors. And even if you believe that Jesus is coming back tomorrow to take us all to heaven, trampling all over God's lovingly made creation and hurting each other is still in direct opposition to the Christian faith. And so I think that is a theology that comes up sometime. I would argue a wrong one, but it's pretty easy to point people back to the actual text and say that doesn't add up.
This raises another approach within the Christian religions themselves and across religions, is that if we're living in this world, do we try to persuade other people on a theological level that we're right and they're wrong? Or is there another level in which we should try to engage people?
I'm fascinated by the power of a religion as an activist. I've worked with so many different faith communities and faith leaders who are motivated by their faith to take action. And I think that is very powerful. Just to give you some practical examples, like the Quakers were they built the first green building on Capitol Hill, which is adjacent to one of the Senate buildings. So they've become real leaders in even their buildings and how they represent their faith to our congressional leadership. You also have the Episcopalian Church, which I'm a part of, has been a leading voice on protecting the Arctic refuge, because the Gwich'in, who live adjacent to the refuge and depend on it for food security and also view it as sacred, are largely Episcopalian. I've worked with a lot of faith leaders who have been involved in the Beyond Coal campaign, which is a large campaign that's been really successful at retiring coal plants. Also, you see, like, talking about the economic piece of it, you're seeing more and more churches divest from fossil fuels, divest their investments from fossil fuels. The Church of England just voted to do that recently. So I think, yeah, but I think the other part of it, besides just the being motivated by faith or kind of mobilizing faith communities to take concrete actions, is that climate change is so scary. It's such a scary, overwhelming problem, especially when you throw in things like global pandemics. And I know that a lot of my activist friends, and myself included, have increasingly either turned back to their childhood faiths or found new spiritual traditions and practices to find courage and strength to face these huge problems. And I know for me, that was, just even in the Christian tradition that I grew up in, the concept of resurrection, the idea of life overcoming death, which you actually see in the natural world as well. Like, life and death are always kind of nourishing and becoming each other. So if you look to creation, you kind of see the concept of resurrection. So I do think that these different, or the Buddhist tradition, we just interviewed a beautiful climate scientist who's a Zen Buddhist teacher as well. And she gave just an incredible conversation about interconnectedness and inner being, and how, just doing, even when you feel overwhelmed, you we're called to just show up and do the next right thing. And told a beautiful story using a Buddhist story around kind of giving us a metaphor for what that looks like. So aside from just taking the concrete action, I think that spiritual communities and spiritual leaders have a huge role to play in helping us find the stories and the narratives, and also just the concrete spiritual practices, prayer, meditation, mindfulness, doing, loving service, loving our neighbors, all of those things that really help us tackle these overwhelming problems in both individual and collective ways without losing hope.
Could I ask you to speculate? Why is there so much fear? Why is there such a lack of courage? Is there something about modern society that has crippled us somehow? I mean, I'm asking you this because there's a school of thought from religious people who'd say it's too much secularism. We become a materialistic secular society. We've lost our spiritual way. And so naturally people have no inner core. Would you agree with that?
I think there's some truth to the fact that as our my generation is the least spiritual generation in the history of the United States. So there's fewer people and people go to church less and less. I mean, a lot of that has to do with partisan politics, like especially in the white evangelical church. I mean, when I was growing up, it was this very vibrant, youth-filled, creative space. And now you go to my dad's church and it's, all old people. And a lot of that has to do with how, as they swung to the right and millennials stayed in the middle or swung to the left. And so unfortunately, that's played a role. But you're right, it has left a lot of people kind of without, whereas my parents growing up, church or whatever, whatever your religious tradition was a really integral part of the community, of your life, of your everyday kind of routines and rituals. And we have lost some of that. And I do think that, and I think part of that also has to do, at least when you're speaking to the United States, like, this heavy emphasis on individuals over the collective, I think is super problematic when you're trying to deal with a really big collective problems. And we need to remember that, like this pandemic is showing us, we really are all connected. Like what happens to our neighbors very much impacts all of us. And so, yeah, there's certainly some big societal problems that both theologically and ideologically that has set us up for this. But also I think we've, to some degree, we need, there's been kind of a divide within the environmental community and the religious community that has been problematic, because you have a lot of the climate movement is led by scientists or policy wonks or lawyers, not by people who have these beautiful stories of hope and kind of concrete rituals to help us grapple with all this, both from the theological perspective and the kind of spiritual perspective, and also I'd argue from sort of more the creative and art perspective, where a lot of hope and courage comes from as well. So
what I find, Anna Marie, interesting and fascinating about what you just said and who you are and what you are is, in an era and in a movement so dominated by science and expertise and data, you have actually come through a process where you're looking at something else. I mean, you just mentioned art. You mentioned rituals. And I think when I grew up, you talked to me about rituals, I would say, oh my goodness, want to go to one of those churches? but you obviously have sensed in human motivation and human action that there's a whole non-scientific realm which maybe we should not overlook.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why our podcast was created for that very reason. We use stories to inspire people, to bring heart and humanity to climate change, because if we were going to win based on science and facts, we would have won already. Like we haven't won on that. So you can't argue ourselves out of this. We have all the great science behind us. It really is motivating people on a heart level, on an emotional level, on a courageous level, on a spiritual level. And that is definitely not the realm of most scientists.
Well, I think we're running
Although
out.
actually one of my favorite, oh, go ahead.
Well, actually, do you mind, Steve, can I just jump in real quickly?
Sure.
And I'd like to, this is Kurt, I'd like to see if you've got any, I know we're limited for time, any brief comments about the prior panel, because you represent the other part of Christianity, the non-Catholic Christians.
Yeah, I mean, I'm deeply inspired, and I think this is probably a little bit reflective of my generation, where we're not as intimidated by kind of interfaith conversations as maybe my parents, at least when you're coming out of the evangelical space. but I have been so inspired by Pope Francis and the kind of Catholic social teachings, and the encyclical. And so I'm deeply heartened to hear these different stories. Also, we interviewed an amazing Muslim voice who's an activist and who wrote a book called The Green Dean, and he just shared with us these beautiful perspectives from the Muslim faith on why we should be caring for the earth. And it was one of those interviews where I cried because it was just such a gorgeous way of describing all this. So I'm deeply moved by the different religious perspectives, and I think one of the important things that was noted is, even though there's obviously a lot of differences, there's also a lot of overlap about how we should be working together.
Great, thanks.
If we do have one more, I wanted to ask Anna Jane, if you were in a position to command everybody to do one thing, what would that thing be?
On climate change.
Yes, or something related to that. I mean, open-ended.
Everyone in the world or everyone in the United States?
Take your pick.
Okay. I'm going to pick two things, which I know isn't your answer, but one is just elevating your voice, talking about it more in whatever circles you're in, and to whatever position of power that you have. So if you're a faith leader, engaging your congregations, if you're a business leader, engaging your employees and your customers and your shareholders, if you have the ability to move money, moving it into better things, just really using your power as a human in whatever way you're in to elevate and make this a priority, because it is certainly one of the biggest crises humanity has ever faced, and it's not going away. So yes, using your power and position to do something about it. And then the other thing I would say is really, I found a lot of wisdom in honoring our indigenous elders and spiritual leaders, and just, I think that there's so much to be learned from, putting them in positions of leadership and power, and helping them to overcome some of the incredible problems that have been created. So I think indigenous leadership is a really important part of all this.
Thank you very much, Anna. Kurt, do we have any more time, or I'm not entirely sure?
Steve?
Yes.
I have to apologize, but I've got an early start tomorrow morning, and it's about 12:30 midnight and 30 minutes here in Rome. So I like to say goodbye to everybody. I found a conversation very, very interesting, and I would appreciate if you would circulate the PowerPoint document which I've just sent to you and the other friends, to all the people who might be interested in having a look. And of course, I am at the disposal of all of you, to give further information and further details. And please, let's have sooner or later another meeting like this one, which was most enriching to everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Tiliakos.
Goodbye, Kurt.
Grazie, buonanotte.
Bye.
Steve and Kurt, it's time, and Anna Jane, it's time to wrap up. Any final closing thoughts?
From myself, I think I just would repeat what I said earlier, that I think it is a prejudice, and maybe an uninformed prejudice, that faith perspectives need to be somehow shoved aside from secular life, practical life, science, politics, and that we need to look at faith and spirituality maybe in very deeply constructive human ways, and be sensitive to sectarianism and dogma and the rigidities which religious practice can bring to us, and find, if you will, a higher meaning or a deeper meaning, whichever word you like, to that sense that there is a larger purpose, there's a larger scheme in which we are only a small part.
Super. Anna Jane?
Yeah, I would just second that. I think actually there's a quote I just wanted to leave, which is from Ibrahim Abdul Mateen, the Muslim leader that we just interviewed on our podcast. But he said to all the self-proclaimed religious people, let's honor our prophets and emulate them. It's time to roll up our sleeves, accept our faith's imperative, and get the earth out of this ecological mess.
Well put, well said. All right, over to you, Nigel.
Paul, thank you very much. And we always like to end with some good news on ESGX Live. And my reflections are, firstly, I think it has been fantastic to hear such a sense of shared purpose across the various different religions, and much more points of similarity than points of difference. We've seen the importance of community and creativity and compassion. And I guess it prompted me to think about, what do we, one question for all of us is, what can we do? And one great story that we've seen very recently is a business based in New York and that has outlets in a few cities around the country called Bluestone Lane, which is a coffee business, about 50 or so stores. And what they have done is provide the ability for you to buy not just a coffee for yourself online, but to buy one for someone else. And for every coffee you buy, they will match it threefold so that 4 coffees get delivered to a health worker, which I think is a fantastic initiative. It's not something they're doing to create profit. It creates volume through their business, and it really helps people. The other question I thought to myself was, is all of this worth it? Why would you do it? And I've recently started reading a book called exactly this, Worth It, by a guy called Dan Price, CEO of Gravity Payments, which is, I think, a wonderful story about the benefits of thinking about your team and your employees and putting them first, rather than, just thinking about yourself and solely short-term shareholder gains. Very briefly, we have tomorrow a session on activating academia for climate action. And this is going to be, I think, a very lively and fascinating discussion, much as today has been. And I think with that, I will say thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists who've joined us from a variety of places and our audience across many time zones. So good morning to you in the Asia Pacific region and Australia. Good evening to everyone in Europe, and of course here in the Americas. Have a great afternoon and evening. Thank you very much. And Paul, if you want to say anything else, otherwise we'll bid you goodbye.
We'll see you next time on ESGX, and join us tomorrow for Activating Academia. All the recordings and webinars are at esgx.org and simulcast on YouTube. Talk to you soon.
Bye, thanks.